Hello and welcome. My name is Alejandro Rojas, and we are here with the Scientific Coalition for UAP Research. And these are the presentations that we've been doing in lieu of having our conference this year, obviously due to COVID. And we have Dr. Michael Masters here with us. Hello, Mr. Masters.
Hello. Thanks
How
for
you
having
doing?
me on. It's good to be here to talk about the research, even though the conference got canceled. It's nice we can still do this.
Yep, we're really happy to have you. And just as a
even though the conference got canceled, it's nice we can still do this.
Yep, we're really happy. And just as a short introduction. Michael Masters is a professor of biology, biological anthropology at Montana Tech in Butte, Montana. He received his PhD in anthropology from Ohio State University in 2009, where he specializes in human evolutionary anatomy, archaeology, and biomedicine. He has also been working on his book, Identified Flying Objects, a multidisciplinary scientific approach to the UFO phenomenon, challenging readers to consider new possibilities while cultivating conversations about our ever-evolving understanding of time and time travel. And in fact, you have put together a video for us that we're going to play here. And so we'll play that, and then you'll be available to answer some questions afterwards, right?
Yeah, that sounds great. It's just a podium presentation that I was going to give at the conference. I decided to do it as an actual podium presentation. It's just a more comfortable format for me. So yeah, I'll stick around, and then whenever that's done, we can chat about whatever. So roll it when you're ready.
All right, here we go.
My name is Dr. Michael Masters. I'm a professor of biological anthropology at Montana Tech University in Butte, Montana. My talk today will mostly focus on the biological, anthropological side of things. Some of the other presenters are looking at other aspects of this, so I'm going to focus mostly on that aspect of it. My book, Identified Flying Objects, Multidisciplinary Scientific Approach to UFO Phenomenon, does take into consideration the physics of how backward time travel may be possible. It also looks at astrobiology and astronomy in the context of the extraterrestrial hypothesis and some potential pitfalls with that explanation. But again, today, I mostly just want to go through and talk about some of the main aspects of how we might understand this phenomenon in the context of anthropology. So others have looked at this. Many have come at this question of whether or not these could be our future human descendants. Some have referred to them as temponauts or chrononauts. I refer to them as extra-tempestrials, taking the Latin root ter, meaning earth, out of the word and replacing it with temp, the French word for time, and also tempus, the Latin root for the word time. So just keeping the same term, but making that slight change modifies the meaning of it and puts it more in the context of time rather than those beings being from outside of Earth. So the main idea in this extra-tempestrial model is that the UFOs, the craft, the beings that purportedly pilot them are in fact just us from the future, coming back through time to study their own evolutionary past, the ecology of the past, the geology of the past, any historic events of import that are interesting to them. There's lots of reasons why they could be coming back through time, but the main crux of the model is that they are in fact us, regardless of what their intentions are. Importantly, this is a testable and falsifiable theory. It lends itself more towards scientific examination because of this. Quite simply, if we continue to exist in the future, we will reach a point at some crossroads in our evolutionary future where we become them. Even if we destroy ourselves or are destroyed by an asteroid or some other outside force, we have still tested this model, we falsified it. There's no one left to know, but at least now we do have confirmation that this isn't accurate. But if we do continue to exist in the future, at some point we would know one way or the other whether or not this has always been us coming back through time as more evolved humans. So again, this mostly looks at the model in the context of hominin evolution. Our origins date back about 6 to 8 million years ago. And this long period of time has been marked with an acceleration of change in both our physiological form and also our culture and technology. I'll talk about some of those main changes that have taken place in both. But we can see throughout this period, since we first split with what would eventually become the common chimpanzee, the bonobo chimpanzee who exists today. But this bifurcation took place between 6 and 8 million years ago. We stood upright, we became bipedal, they remained quadrupedal, and we sort of went our separate ways with divergent evolutionary histories, largely as a result of that fact that we stood upright. So if these same patterns exist, these long, persistent patterns that characterize hominin evolution since we did first stand upright, if those persist into the future and we can project these same long-standing trends into the future, we are likely to have a morphological form and advanced technology very similar to what we see with these beings and the craft that they pilot. So it sort of looks at the past and how we got to where we are today, and then connects the future form of humans with these same evolutionary trends that are so characteristic of our unique history on this planet. So a hominin is just us, our bipedal relatives, going back to when that split first took place between us and what would become the chimpanzee between 6 and 8 million years ago. So our bipedalism is a relatively unique characteristic that defines us, it defines our lineage. We don't really see it among other mammals. Some hominoids will walk bipedally for short periods of time, but we are the only terrestrial habitual biped. We're the only ones that do it all of the time. And that's caused a number of unique characteristics, or at least is associated with a lot of things that make us unique among other mammals. The main changes you can see from this chart, if we look at chimpanzees, again, the common chimpanzee, pan troglodyte, and Pantheniscus, the bonobo chimpanzee, they have very long projecting faces and low sloping foreheads. And the main change that characterizes hominin evolution is a trade-off between those two features. We have an enlarged cranium, a bigger brain, we become encephalized. And as our brain expanded, both mediolaterally and moving anteriorly out over top of our eyes, in fact, we're the only mammal with that craniofacial configuration where our brain sits directly above our eyes. But as that's happened, it's left less time and less space for craniofacial prognathism. So our faces have both become retracted and reduced in size. Our teeth have gotten smaller, our mid and lower facial anatomy has gotten smaller, and it's all retracted posteriorly throughout this time. And we can see this in looking at other animals as well. Domesticated dogs, it's very clear. If you look at a Doberman Pinscher or Collie, for instance, they have these long projecting muzzles and a low sloping forehead. And compare those to a Chihuahua or a Pug, for instance, who have a really retracted face and a large domed cranium at the top of their skull. So we can see this general bow plan pretty ubiquitously throughout a lot of different mammals. And as we evolved specifically, largely in association with our bipedalism, we have traded our face for an enlarged brain. So that is a pretty unique characteristic. A lot of it does stem from our becoming bipedal. If we can imagine walking quadrupedally and then we suddenly stand up, we're going to be looking up at the sky. So the main thing that needed to take place was our heads rotating down so that our visual plane was in line with the horizon and we could see where we're going, not run into things. And as that happened, our basicranium flexed in order to accommodate this new form of locomotion. We oftentimes talk about the slinky hypothesis in this regard. And if we can imagine the foramen magnum at the back of the skull being quadrupedally located toward the posterior part of the skull, and our faces being more projecting forward. And as our foramen magnum rotated down, so our skulls can sit on top of our spine and we can see where we're going, and our faces became reduced and retracted, you can see that all of this space opens up the top of the skull. So a big part of why our brains are so big may just simply be because we stood upright. So this is associated with our increased brain size, our encephalization, also our facial retraction. One unique characteristic of Homo sapiens sapiens, specifically our own lineage, is that we have a marked degree of neurocranial globularity, meaning a very broad, round head. So our brains haven't just moved forward and increased in size, but they've also increased mediolaterally. Our parietal lobes, temporal lobes, occipital lobes, to some extent, have also increased. We have these big, round, bobble-headed characteristics that we don't see even in more recent, closely related hominid species. So here you can very clearly see this trade-off. If we look at facial projection in relation to cranial size and shape, we can see that modern humans up here, demarked with a pink square, have very large crania relative to our faces. Our faces are much smaller. Looking at extinct Homo varieties, Homo erectus, Homo habilis, for instance, can see that they have more projecting faces, lower sloping foreheads, smaller brains. And then as we go further back with the Australopithecines, Sahelanthropus chadensis, and then also getting into the apes, you can see that trade-off even more. So this has been the main trait that characterizes hominin evolution throughout this very long period of time. Other aspects of bipedalism that have added to our uniqueness as a species is that allowed us to use our hands for new and exciting things. We're not burdened with locomotion, using them to move around, but rather we can use them to make stone tools, which we first started doing about 3.3 million years ago. To make fire, also a very useful tool that has aided us in our evolution ever since. That occurred about 1.8 million years ago with Homo erectus. All of the technologies that we have today are allowed for by the fact that we have free use of our hands, freed up by walking only on two legs rather than all four. So in the context of bioculture, this relationship between our biology and our culture, which is unique to humans, our culture has shaped our biology and our biology has shaped our culture to a large extent. This feedback loop existed between the brain and our behaviors. As we invented tools, fire, social organization, we lived in larger groups, we did more complex things, we start to see a trade-off between the brain size, the face size, and also just the complexity of our behavior. So we start to see that our culture really does begin to influence our biology to a much greater extent. We also see that bipedalism is very rare among other mammals on Earth. We're one of few, as I mentioned, that does it even in relation to birds and other mammals, but we're the only habitual biped among our closely related primate species. So if it's so rare on Earth, it's also likely to be rare on other planets. And this is important in the context of the question as to whether or not we would have humanoid, bipedal, upright walking, humanoid life evolve separately on another planet. It's not likely that they would look anything like us, especially because a lot of the data, if we look at the data that comes out of the planetary habitability laboratory at the University of Arecibo, we see that the majority of planets are actually quite a bit larger than our own. We have a relatively small planet compared to most of them that have been found as part of the Kepler mission. Only about 2.2% of all of the planets that have been found by the Arecibo laboratory are the same size as or smaller than Earth. And that means that they would have a much larger gravity than what we have here on our own planet. And we suffer from a lot of problems with bipedalism. In fact, there was an article came out in 2005 by the former director of the Cleveland Museum of Natural History here in the United States, in Ohio, the state of Ohio specifically, where I went to school and grew up. Published a paper called The Perils of Being Bipedal and noted a number of different problems that we suffer from on this planet Earth that has a gravity of only 9.8 meters per second squared. So on a planet that's larger than our own, much larger than our own, Tau Ceti, for instance, the only two planets that are thought to maybe even be habitable are 4.4 up to 6 times that of Earth. So if bipedalism is so difficult here, it's very unlikely that you would have a bipedal humanoid form develop on any of these planets. And it's really not just the gravity and the biomechanical aspects of it. There's also a lot of other limitations, not just to being bipedal, but for life to evolve at all or to even get off of the planet. And there was a really good episode of a program called What If that just came out recently that highlights some of these problems. I'd like to show a little clip from one of those because it really demonstrates how many problems we would have, not just evolving on, but surviving on or leaving a planet that happens to be larger than our own. And as we see from the data that's coming out from the Kepler mission and other studies, most of them are quite a bit larger. You can see from this that we would have a lot of extra problems, not just walking upright, but even existing on a planet much larger than our own, even slightly larger than our own, because of the effect of gravity, the dangers of asteroids impacting Earth, wiping out all of life, the difficulty of leaving Earth to even go to other places to explore. All of those would need to be taken into consideration. So other trends that are important in hominin evolution, one that exists really throughout the long history of hominin history is neoteny, paedomorphosis specifically, which is the retention of juvenilized traits into adulthood. And this is another thing that we see commonly reported with these extra-tempestrial beings, is that they're oftentimes described as having very childlike traits. Big heads, small faces, oversized heads for their bodies, sort of cute characteristics. Travis Walton, for instance, referred to them as overgrown fetuses in his description of these beings. And this is another characteristic that is really dominant throughout human evolution. And you can see it very clearly in looking at a adult chimpanzee versus an infant chimpanzee. If we compare them to humans, we're much more similar to the infant chimpanzee than the adult chimpanzee, simply because we've retained more of these juvenilized traits into adulthood. So we retain childlike characteristics even once we finish growth. And these juvenilized traits of extra-tempestrials, these future humans, would indicate that they are in fact a part of our lineage, and this same enduring trend of neoteny and paedomorphosis has continued into the distant future. We've also domesticated ourselves. A lot of people don't realize that really since the dawn of agriculture, humans have been involved in a process of self-domestication. The same types of traits that we see in domesticating other animals. Early studies have been done with foxes. They develop a lot of the same traits as what we see in domesticated dogs. Floppy ears, droopy tails. They start to bark. They start to talk more amongst themselves. Lack of pigmentation. This could help explain the grayish color of the skin in more distant relatives of humans in the distant future. A loss of pigmentation is another trait that we see commonly in association with self-domestication. We also find that our skulls are moving toward more feminine type characteristics, what's known as craniofacial feminization. This also occurs in association with self-domestication, and as does prosocial behaviors. We start to interact in nicer ways with each other, even though we're still a warring, angry species for the most part. It has definitely gotten better throughout the last 10, 12,000 years. We live in larger, more peaceful social groups, and that is another characteristic of these extra-tempestrials, is that they're oftentimes described as being very loving, nurturing, having a deep sense of empathy, which we would also expect if those same pro-social behaviors continue into the future. With regard to craniofacial feminization, what's interesting is if we look at the shape of the skull, and this is a geometric morphometric analysis I did for my book, where we can factor out size, in a procrustes analysis and just look at the shape of the skull. And as we move from a more male shape up through the average of male and female combined to a more extreme female shape, we can see that we start to develop characteristics that are more similar to the craniofacial form of these alien beings. You can see this more from the lateral side as well, where we start to develop an even more projecting neurocranium, a broader, wider skull, more retracted face. And in many ways, this mirrors the same dominant craniofacial trends that have existed throughout the last 6 to 8 million years, where we have this trade-off between the projecting face and the low slope forehead to a more anteriorly projecting, wider neurocranium and a more retracted face. And you can see in this video representation of this that you have this same trade-off occurring. And what's notable is watch the eyes. If you look at the eye orbits, another commonly described trait of these extra-tempestrial beings is they have very large oval shaped sort of wrap-around eyes. And you can see if you look at especially the lateral superior part of the eye orbit, that they do start to kind of move outward toward the side and sort of up in that corner. So this is again something sort of a minor detail if we do continue this trend toward craniofacial feminization, where we might expect to see that. And this is also something that is reported in these extra-tempestrial encounters. It's always, they're always described as having large round heads, small faces, a slit for a mouth, small nose, diminished ears, and then these large wraparound eyes as well. With regard to eye size itself, why might they have such big eyes? Unfortunately, eyes are hard to study in the paleoanthropological record because they're soft tissue and they don't persist. But the eye orbits and their relationship with other aspects of our craniofacial anatomy is actually what I focused on for my dissertation research and have published subsequent studies since then. But even though we can't directly measure the eye, we do know that there's a pleiotropic relationship between the eye and the brain. And this is important because what pleiotropy means is when you have the same gene or set of genes coding for the same characteristics. So if our eyes and our brains are being influenced by the same genes and our eyes are growing larger, we would expect our brains are growing larger as well. Or rather, if our brains are growing larger, we would expect that our eyes are also growing larger because of this pleiotropic gene relationship. And we can see that the brain and the eyes are very closely linked throughout fetal ontogeny, especially the optic vesicles, the earliest stages of eye formation, grow directly out of the forebrain during early fetal growth and development. So they're very intricately linked early on and throughout life. And in an evolutionary sense, if our brains do continue to expand, it is likely that our eyes would also grow larger in association with that. Other dominant trends, reduction in body hair. There's a lot of potential explanations for why we have reduced our body hair. And we actually have the same amount, the same density of hair follicles as our closest living relative, the chimpanzee. However, we have much smaller hair. They have sort of peach fuzz compared to their very large hair follicles, the fur that they and other mammals have. Again, these beings, these future humans, are described as being bald. The Nordics have sort of light, thin hair. Others also are described with hair, but once we get into more distant forms, like the Greys, for instance, they're almost always described as being entirely hairless. We also have some trends that might indicate why they might be coming back. In some instances, they've even mentioned, explicitly stated that they're coming back for genes and chromosomes because of problems with reproduction. Jim Peniston's encounter in Rendlesham in 1980 is a good example of this. But there does seem to be this focus on the genes of humans. In the context of the biological classification of species, there's really no use of our genes to an organism that's a different species. This indicates, especially if there is a hybrid program, if you believe that there is hybridization, you have to acknowledge that for this to take place, by definition, we would have to be the same species. But This dominant trend toward genetic homogenization, ever since humans started traveling more broadly around the earth, we've become one interbreeding population, and we could suffer from incest in the distant future and have to deal with problems related to increase in homozygosity, increase in genetic disorders as a result of that. So diversifying the gene pool, getting novel gene variants from individuals, haplogroups, haplotypes that didn't make it into the future, it's possible that going into the past may be the only way to get new gene variants in a population that's become entirely homogenized. The breeding program could also be to just maintain a workforce, or to have people that can do things, and to have a base of a human population. We see diminished birth rates all throughout the world, and it's projected that in even 50 to 100 years, will be far below the replacement rate in almost every country throughout the world, even less developed countries where it remains high. And that leads to all kinds of problems. A population implosion means there's no one in the workforce, there's no one to care for the elderly. So it could be manufacturing children simply as a way of getting around some of these problems. It also helps get around the problem of balancing being in the workforce versus having children. That leads to inequality between the sexes. So having external gestation with genes that are sampled from the past, just speculating, but it might help explain some of the aspects of this phenomenon in the context of a current global trend. Obviously, we've gotten more intelligent over the years, and that is likely to continue. We're still going to have dumb people, but we're still going to have smart people who are inventing things and making things. And we would expect that this would also include innovations in material sciences, our understanding of the cosmos and physics and the universe, possibly to the extent that we will unravel the mysteries of time and figure out how to actually travel back in time. That's definitely something that we would expect. If there's nothing in the laws of physics that prevent backward time travel, with increased intelligence and a better understanding of the universe, we are likely to eventually be able to do that. So taken together, combining sort of astrobiology, astronomy, physical anthropology in the context of this model, if we look at all of the characteristics of these alien forms, and again, there are variants, sometimes you'll roughly 5% actually, based on the Dr. Edgar Mitchell Foundation's FREE study, about 5% describe seeing reptile-like or insect-like beings, but the vast majority are described as human, not just humanoid, but altogether human, and other variants, the grays, the tall grays, the short grays. But if we look at the majority of these, we see that they ubiquitously have 2 arms, 2 legs, which is an Earth characteristic of not just mammals, but a lot of other animal species. We're tetrapods, we have 4 limbs. We also have pentadactyly, having 5 digits at the end of each one of those limbs, also described among these alien beings. We are bipedal. Again, that's the trait that defines the hominin lineage. So if we're talking about bipedal humanoids, we really have to consider that they are likely hominins, since that is the trait that defines us. And I've said 100 times, if the beings that are getting out of these craft have 200 legs and they're kind of squid monster spider things, never would have written this book. But the fact that they're so commonly described in such human terms indicates that there is some sort of phylogenetic relationship. The big round heads, the encephalization, the neurocranial globularity, that unique characteristic of Homo sapiens sapiens is also important to consider, as I've mentioned throughout this lecture. Small faces, the reduction in our facial prognathism, this trade-off between the brain and face, also indicates that they are us. The small noses, the small mouths, the diminished ears, all of these things are exactly what we'd expect to see with the continuation of past human trends. 2 large eyes, talked about this pleiotropic relationship between our ocular anatomy and our cerebral anatomy. And if that continues into the future and our brains do continue to enlarge, whether it be in size or change in shape or grow and pack into the skull, we would expect a concomitant increase in eye size. Childlike features, so commonly described, especially in the shorter gray aliens who have very childlike traits, could be the continuation of these same paedomorphic trends that define our own lineage. Their ability to communicate in our languages is also an important thing to consider. It's not likely that beings on another planet would know our languages or have access to information to even learn our languages, but with archived records, with the ability to travel into the past, you could easily learn the language of past human groups. The technology advanced beyond our own. It's also very unlikely that we would have two planets that exist at the same time, where you have humanoid beings that develop concomitantly on those planets, where one just happens to be more technologically advanced than the other, but still share all of these same traits. Much more parsimonious explanation is that we evolved on the same planet. We have these phylogenetic ties, but they're just simply coming back and observing us with the anthropological tool of time travel and the more sophisticated technologies that they've developed since our current present. In fact, part of the variation that we see among these aliens may simply be the result of what time period they're coming back from. I refer to this in the book as temporal ancestry, in the same way that if we went back 100 years ago, we're going to look very similar to the humans that exist then. If we go back 500,000 years ago, we're going to look quite a bit different. If we go back 2 million years ago and pick up Homo erectus, for instance, now we're the ones with the big round heads, the big eyes, the small faces, the hairlessness, the advanced technology. We are the aliens in every sense of the word. So if we can model that forward, if we can project that forward, we can understand how we would look different in the past and they would look different to us, depending on what time they're coming back from. Other things to keep in mind, these examinations that are almost always in existence in these abductions very much mimic exactly what I would do as a paleoanthropologist if I had access to this technology. I would pick them up, examine them. I would take tissue samples, skin scrapings, examine teeth, toenails, fingernails, take trimmings, gamete extraction, taking sperm and egg, the anal probe, taking fecal samples. We can learn a lot from fecal matter. In fact, it's how we know that as Neanderthals, we consumed approximately 7,000 calories per day, and mostly meat. So you can actually learn a lot from getting that information. We also see that these UFOs are most commonly observed during major historical events. We would expect that of individuals that are interested in us and things that happen in their own past. And there may even be some time tourism component to that, where people pay a large sum of money to travel back in time and see their favorite period in history, or observe the Great Pyramids being built, or World War II, the Foo Fighters that were reported so commonly during that conflict. As I mentioned, it's also highly improbable that we would evolve the exact same way on different planets at the same time and have just slight differences in our technology, and that we'd still be able to find each other in the vastness of the universe and the vastness of even our own galaxy. It's very unlikely that this would take place, and particularly since we've only been sending out radio waves for approximately 50, 60 years. We would also expect that if an alien being, an extraterrestrial, did evolve on another planet and did happen to locate us, that if they came all the way across the universe, they would at least get out and say hello, or possibly kill us and take all of our resources. But the fact that they just sort of sit around and watch us or pick us up from time to time indicates that they don't have malintent and that they're most likely not from a distant planet. Otherwise, we would expect some formal contact. But if they are from time, we wouldn't necessarily expect this. Not that it can screw up a timeline or cause paradoxes per se, but at a time before we understand who they are and why they're here, we would kind of expect exactly what we see, that they just sort of sit back and watch, observe us, study us without any overt integration of themselves or any malicious activities. What's the point in hurting yourself in the past? It only harms you in the future. So the peaceful relationship we would seem to have with them, being a very one-sided relationship, admittedly, would indicate that they're not from a different planet, and they're certainly not harmful to us. So for more information on the book, can be found on my website, idflyobj.com. I also have a Facebook page, Twitter account where I post updates. And the book's available in multiple formats on various retail outlets throughout the world, really. Amazon obviously is a good resource, but there's also an ebook, an audiobook, and paperbacks available in many other places as well. And thank you for your time.
All right, so there is the video. And I guess what we'll start off, just so you know, Martin Willis of Podcast UFO is also helping out in the background. So what we'll do now for the Q&A section is Martin and I will ask questions. So we'll be in the background and you'll hear our voices. But I guess to start off, there was a video that we originally had in there that we had to take out due to copyright, but maybe you can share what was in that video and how it pertains to the topic.
Yeah. So the video comes from a web series called What If, a pretty popular web series on YouTube. And it looked at this question of what life would be like if it evolved on a super Earth. Would we have humans? What would our physiological form be? And addresses some other questions too related to, could we get off of our planet? What type of fuel propulsion system would we need? We'd be more bombarded by asteroids and other things flying around the solar system. So would life even develop? Would it just constantly start and then be killed off? And somebody pointed out in the comments that there are biases that indicate that planets are larger simply because of the astrobiological and astronomical techniques we use to identify them, which is true. If we're looking for gravitational pull on other celestial bodies, transiting, you're going to see that passing in front of a star if it's a larger planet. So there is certainly that. But again, my point that even on our own planet, a relatively small planet, or even if other planets do have the same gravity, we still see the bipedalism as rare here. So it is likely to be rare on other planets, even if they are about the same size as Earth. But yeah, I do recommend that people check that out. I think we could probably put a link below to that video. Unfortunately, YouTube put the kibosh on us in the first trial run of this, since it did stream some YouTube content for a little too long, but it is worth checking out.
All right. Can you hear me?
Yes. Hello.
All right. Yeah. The signal question, the signal that was the person in the chat. Do bigger eyes suggest better light gathering, or is it impossible to know without studying them?
Well, they certainly do on this planet. If you look at tarsiers and galagos and other nocturnal animals, they do have much larger eyes relative to their body size and much larger pupils to let in that light. So perhaps we could infer that. It may indicate something about where we evolve or how we evolve after the present time. But as I mentioned, we would expect our eyes to grow larger just in association with the encephalization if our brains do continue to grow, and especially the frontal lobe of the brain. But that definitely doesn't preclude anything about environmental changes. I try to avoid speculating about those things in the book simply because we can't know what type of environment will be evolving in association with in the future. But that is certainly something to consider. And really across all contactee experiences and abduction reports, the eyes are just such a prominent feature. People talk about this intense sense of empathy and ability to communicate, looking deep within the soul. So it may have some sort of, I don't know, consciousness connection or some sort of communicative aspect in the future as well.
All right. Another question is from Robert Powell. He says, does Neanderthal, is that how you say it these days? I'm used to like Neanderthal, but
yeah, I mean, it's the German pronunciation. Sure. Say it how you want.
Does it fit on the hominid chart line?
Yeah, Neanderthals are not our direct ancestors. They died off. We likely killed them off around 35, 40,000 years ago. But there was introgression. There clearly was interbreeding. We just survived them. We had better tools, better technology. We were more adaptable. We lived in larger groups. We had more complex language. And those things likely helped us outcompete them, either in direct conflict or just in a relatively harsh environment at the end of the last ice age. But they are certainly on our family tree. They are a close relative. We just did not directly evolve from them. We share a common ancestor with Homo heidelbergensis going back about 600 to 800,000 years ago.
All right, Robert Powell has another question here. Why would a species capable of time travel not also be capable of modifying genes as needed?
Oh, I'm sure they can. We can do it now, and we are extremely primitive by comparison. So, yeah, when I talk about the biological species concept and how if they have the ability to reproduce with us, that definitely doesn't mean that they're not modifying their genes or modifying ours in order to do that. I mean, you have some cases like V.S. Boas in Brazil who got freaky with these things in real time. Who knows what came of that? I don't think they sent him a memo on whether or not she had a baby after they did the nasty and the pasty. But there was definitely other cases of full-on interbreeding as well. So yeah, we can't know the answer to that. We can't know whether or how much gene modification is taking place, but I would definitely acknowledge that that is certainly a technology that we would expect them to have if they are extraterrestrial and they did want to hybridize with us. There's no doubt in my mind that they could do so. But I think kind of the Occam's razor take on this would be that we already share so many traits, then we could probably assume, or at least a safer, simpler explanation might be that they are still related to us.
Is nasty and the pasty a scientific term?
It is, yeah. You'll find that in scientific textbooks worldwide. Actually, no, that's actually from Futurama. I don't remember which episode, but I think it's actually probably one that a lot of viewers will remember, the Roswell That Ends Well episode where they go back in time and become the Roswell crash, and Fry becomes his own grandfather. I think he used that term in there, kind of borrowed that.
That episode.
Yeah, it's a great one.
Here's the next question, and everybody should watch that episode. Great episode. The connections or contentions that exoplanets have mostly larger masses than Earth is likely caused by our methods of exoplanet detection. Our method of exoplanet detection favor larger planets. So they do,
yeah. That's one of the only ones that I saw in the comment thread. I made some technical errors when we first started this, so I couldn't see all the questions, but I did catch that one. And yeah, I totally agree that there are likely some biases with regard to our perception of how large other planets are. So it's definitely something to consider.
All right. Matthew Shadagis has this question. You can't travel back in time without negative mass, which we have not only not discovered for longer than unusable short times, but no theory predicts it even. Can you work around this?
Yeah, so the negative mass issue is only if you're thinking about backward time travel in the context of going faster than the speed of light. So with the Alcubierre machine, with traveling really in any sort of hyperspace or as fast as or faster than the speed of light, you have to have negative mass in front, and then positive mass behind it creates this bubble and can move the object by essentially moving the space around it. However, most of the solutions to Einstein's field equations, since he published his theory of general relativity in 1915, don't involve negative mass or negative energy, but rather you can do it with the rotation, at least based on these solutions, the rotation of a highly massive positive mass or positive energy device. that is able to warp space-time, local space-time, in order to go into the global past. So with a heavy enough or highly energetic, and I point out in the book that the electromagnetic force is 10 to the 40 times stronger than gravity. If you're able to warp space-time with electromagnetism, it may be possible to do this without really having to manipulate gravity or to have any sort of negative mass characteristics of the craft. So yeah, I don't only see that as a workaround. I see it as probably the main way in which that happens. And you might be able to infer something from these craft themselves. We have this expression in biology that form follows function. And if we look at these most commonly described disc-shaped craft, and obviously there's exceptions, the triangles, and I have some thoughts on that I'm writing about in my new book. But the disc-shaped craft seem to have these same properties of something that can rotate very rapidly. The light, people always ask, why does UFO need light? If they have all of this other technology, the light very well may be an aspect of that electromagnetism that allows them to warp space-time and create these closed time-like curves. So if the form of this object implies its function of backward time travel, I think we should consider that in looking at the entire picture of this phenomenon.
All right, the next question. Dirk is asking, if they are making hybrids, is there any way possible to mix Earth DNA with off-planet DNA?
Yeah, I mean, that kind of comes back to what we were just talking about with, if they can time travel, can't they manipulate our DNA or theirs in order to hybridize? One thing that I would point out, though, is it implies that they have DNA. We happen to develop most likely RNA first, about 3.8 billion years ago on this planet. And then DNA, deoxyribonucleic acid, came shortly thereafter. And it's seemingly a completely random coding system. We have 4 base pairs, guanine, cytosine, thymine, and adenine, that are the coding system of all life, with the exception of viruses that have RNA, but we don't consider viruses alive anyway, so it's kind of a moot point. But if another life form developed a completely different coding system that didn't involve any sort of amino acids or proteins or these base pairs, then could we still hybridize? Probably, if they had super advanced technology, but it would definitely complicate things. And you still have the issue of finding each other, being able to travel these vast distances. And UFOs can go very, very fast. They clearly have the ability to manipulate space-time. So I wouldn't discount that. But if they're a silicone-based life form instead of carbon-based, there's a lot of other things that come into it beyond just our genetics.
What are some of the triggers that begin the change in a hominid evolution, and how gradual is it?
Well, the first one that I kind of harped on initially in this presentation is bipedalism. That was really the trait that defines our lineage, simply because it enacted so many other changes. So in the context of what really spurred it, you can trace it back to that. I also mentioned the biocultural evolution. So how at some point in our relatively recent evolutionary past, at least with regard to the acceleration that's been taking place, culture has become a major factor. So it's initiated a number of changes or shifts in not just the complexity of our species, but our physical form as well. A good example is lactose tolerance. The wild type, the normal situation, is to not be able to process lactase, or lactose rather, because we stop producing the gene that makes lactase, which breaks down lactose in dairy products at a young age. But because of selective pressures, because of the environment, we continue to produce lactase into adulthood, so we can still consume dairy products. But that's simply because of our culture, that we domesticated animals and then selected for the prolonged production of the lactase enzyme. And there's tons of other examples. But if we go back to the origin of stone tools, about 3 to 3.3 million years ago. That was another one that really spurred things along and really got us moving and created this feedback loop between our culture and biology that is really unique to humans. Chimpanzees have culture, they use tools to some extent, but not nearly as much as we do. And then again, fire 1.8 million years ago, agriculture about 12,000 years ago. Those really just propelled us forward and created this accelerating change that, if it continues into the future, is likely to create more physical and cultural changes at a faster rate. As long as we exist, I would think there might be setbacks if we nuke each other or have periods of war and famine. But for the most part, just based on longstanding trends, we would expect that acceleration to continue.
All right. Just a quick note. Matthew Zydagas, who asked the question about time travel, is a physicist. And we don't need to get into more details into the weed, but he just made an interesting note that for him, time travel seems harder to justify than alien life. I think that's an interesting perspective coming from a physicist, because usually they feel that the opposite. It seems like the distances are too far.
Yeah, I've heard both arguments, and obviously it's a contentious issue within the physics community. And yeah, you have people on both sides. Many don't see a problem with it at all. Obviously, I highlight the naysayers in my book as well. One of the most prominent being Stephen Hawking, who is staunchly opposed to the idea, but there are a number of others, Igor Novikov, Kip Thorne, Paul Davies, who really don't see any issue with it. And actually, I quote a study by Ehrman et al. From, I think it was 2008, who did a broad-based look at the literature. It's a literature review of not just the physics community, because this isn't just a question for physicists. Philosophers have been debating the question of time and time travel for centuries. So their results were that there is nothing that prohibits backward time travel. So yeah, there's still people that are against it, and especially in the physics community. But the broad consensus is that, at least from what Ehrman et al. Found and what I've seen from the literature, that it's not completely prohibitive.
Yeah, Michael, by the way, has a great video with us like this that we did with him too on dark matter and UFOs, if people want to watch that. But here's a question from Daniel Blaze. He says, don't the Nords not have large heads and eyes? And what he means by that, I think, is the reports of human-looking entities that are allegedly aliens.
Yeah, I love that question. And that's something that I spent a good amount of time talking about in my book, and even more so in the upcoming book, because in addition to the variation that I mentioned with regard to the insect-like and reptilian type beings that, as I quoted in the presentation, about 5% based on the Dr. Edgar Mitchell study fall into that category. But you do have ones that are entirely human. And I cite a couple of case studies in this upcoming book where you have full-on humans coming out of these UFOs, these disc-shaped craft, having verbal conversations, speaking to these individuals just normally. Obviously, their technology is different, their clothing's different, they're wearing this ubiquitous kind of one-piece jumpsuit. Later case is more of a spandex type thing. And then they get back in, they leave, they go about their business. Others who are also seemingly very human communicate telepathically. And then you have the Nordics, you have ones that are described as being very East Asian looking. And I talk about this in the context of what I refer to as temporal ancestry, in the same way that we have different ancestral groups with regard to those who evolved in sub-Saharan Africa, Australia, the Americas, Europe, and the Far East. We can see these differences among them based on where they evolved. We would expect that if people are coming back from different time periods, and if they were ones that were more proximate to our own, that they would look more like us. So these Nordics may be ones who are not only from that region, but also ones that come from a period in time that's closer to our own. So it's very possible that these grays are from a more distant time period, And it's even possible that the ones that we confuse with insects and reptiles are just from a very distant point in our evolutionary future where their humanness has been completely lost. Or it's possible that humans are dead and insects and reptiles, who clearly have staying power on this planet based on their own evolutionary history, have taken over, developed intelligence, and also discovered backward time travel technology. So, yeah, I think that the Nordics and the East Asians and the ones that are described as altogether human, without the big round head and the big eyes and the tiny faces and slits for a mouth, may just be us from a point in our evolutionary future that's relatively close to our own.
Signal has this. Michael, would there be ethical implications for scooping up a being and taking samples?
I think so. Yeah, I or raping them, impregnating women against their will and sucking out the fetus. Absolutely. It's kind of a shitty thing to do if you think about it. You definitely couldn't get away with that in any research capacity today. We have the IRB, Institutional Review Board, that looks at every research at any public university to make sure that it complies with ethical guidelines, especially if you're working with children or minority groups or prisoners, any subjugated group, to make sure that they're not being harmed. With a lot of the things that happen during abductions, where people are forcibly kidnapped at night and a lot of things are done to them, they seemingly go out of their way to make them forget. There's always sort of an attempt, or at least almost always an attempt, to wipe their mind clean and to not let them remember it. It's been interesting in researching this new book that a lot of people are sort of immune to that. They remember everything, whereas other people just feel, there's a trigger. They feel that something weird happened to them. They have these strange nightmares, and then later are able to access some of those memories. But yeah, I think there's huge ethical implications. There's one case study in Philip Mantle's book, I think it's called Without Consent, that talks about how what they're doing is for the greater good. It's more important than these individuals, but it's for either humanity as a whole, if these are future humans, or it's for these extraterrestrials, if they're from a different planet, that there's some benefit to them, where the sacrifices of the few reap mass benefits for the many. So yeah, it's something that I struggle with. If they are humans and they have greater empathy, how are they able to do these things with a clean conscience and physically and mentally scar people oftentimes for their entire lives? But in the context of the needs of the many outweigh the few, and in the context of future human evolution, it's possible that they're, I don't know, I hate to say sacrificial lambs, but perhaps they're contributing in some way that we will only know in the future.
All right, this next question is another from Robert Powell. He asks, what is your thought regarding our increasing body size and aggressive nature? How did that change?
Yeah, body size is a tricky one. We have these periods where we get taller and shorter and fatter and skinnier. And a lot of it's environmental. Where I did my graduate work at Ohio State, we actually had a whole subsection in our department, in the anthropology department, specifically looking at bioarchaeology. So looking at how physical size changes, mostly before agriculture and then after agriculture, because that's where we see most of these changes. But we also worked very closely with the economics department, where they were studying how economics changes body size. And if you plot height, you can see that during periods of depression, periods of war, especially World War I, World War II, that heights decreased tremendously, and then had been going up since then. And some of the tallest people are in Norway and Sweden, I believe. So height, weight, those things are kind of hard to predict in the context of the future, because they are so influenced by the environment, in the same way that we can't necessarily say how much our increased eye size, if this is to take place in the future, is the result of genetics or epigenetics or environmental influences. I think it's hard to really say for sure what our body type may be. Seemingly, we do get skinny if these are future humans. The big heads, the small faces, are usually sitting on top of frail, tiny little necks and tiny bodies. But who knows? I certainly don't have an answer to that.
Daniel asks, our concept of time is very linear. Have you considered the many worlds theory and how that might factor in with your work?
Yes, since a very young age. In fact, it's always fascinated me. Yeah, and it's really fundamental to this question too, is what happens when we go back in time? Do we create a change in the context of what was going to happen when we leave that time in the future and enact this change? Are we creating a new timeline where suddenly everything is different from the timeline from which you came, simply because you interacted with the past? And yeah, it's a really interesting question. I try not to get into that debate too much in this book. I mostly stuck with the block universe, block time interpretation, and largely drew from Igor Navakov's self-consistency principle, where if you go into the past, anything that you were going to do in that past, you had already done prior to leaving from the future, simply because these points in time are intricately linked in the four-dimensional block universe. So it's another interpretation. It's very important to consider. If we are creating different timelines, then there's potential issues about moving back and forth between them. How do we get back to our own timeline after we're there, if we're jumping dimensions? And I kind of consider the interdimensional and also the future human models to be different sides of the same coin for this reason. If we're talking about interdimensional beings, are they ones that are coming from a different timeline who still share some sort of evolutionary history with us, but who branched off because of whatever factors took place? There's also issues with the law of conservation of mass. How do we just create entirely new universes that have all of the same properties, but just slightly different because of this one thing that is one change? Can we have infinite universes? So there's also the question, can we ever even know if there's no way to study other dimensions? In the context of this model, it may be untestable. I've seen that criticism as well. So yeah, I definitely think we should consider it, and especially in the context of this phenomenon and interdimensional versus time travel, self-consistency, a block universe model. But unfortunately, I don't think we're at a point in our understanding of the laws of physics to be able to know that for sure yet.
All right. This next question from Excalibur. What is the expected trend of the human genome as you go far into the future? That is, will we be healthier, more intelligent, or opposite, where genetic diseases might be more prevalent?
Yeah, that's a tough one. I've always kind of liked the time machine model, where we have I forget what they're called. There's the underground race and then the above ground race. It's played out in a number of different future human scenarios, that same kind of idea. The Morlocks or something, I think they're called. But yeah, I mean, again, it's difficult to know what's going to happen with our genes, what's going to happen with our environment. Are we going to destroy this planet and have to live in space? But generally speaking, I think the trend, and I'm just speculating here, but I think the trend is likely to be toward broader awareness of health and things that help prolong our life history cycle. We already have a very extended life history cycle simply because of genetic changes and also the neoteny and paedomorphic trends that I mentioned in the presentation. So how do we reap the benefits of that? How do we continue to live as long as we can, whether it be through medical developments or better diets, consuming things in different ways. Will we just eat pills and then that'll provide all the nutrients we need? If we can look at these beings as future humans, there may be some indication of that. It'd be hard to stuff a giant cheeseburger in those tiny little slit mouths that they have. And there's also issues with our heads rotating down more and pinching the nasopharynx area even more than it already is. We've accommodated by having a mediolateral expansion of our mandibles, our jaws. We have a V-shaped configuration here, which allowed our heads to rotate down and our mid and lower facial anatomy to shift backward as well. And if that continues into the future, can we even eat food in the same way? Can we even talk the same way? And that may be an aspect of why we become telepathic in association with increased consciousness and cognitive abilities as well. But yeah, I don't know. I mean, I would like to think that as we become more aware of ways to improve our health, that we do. But again, I can't know. At some point, it'd be awesome just to go look, to get a ride in one of these things and go see what humanity's future is like. If that ever happens, I'll definitely let you know. But I can't predict that.
Yeah, someone was speculating they could be vegan in the future. Never mind a big cheeseburger.
Yeah, I know. And then people talk about, I just told my wife the other day that I don't want to live in a future with no bacon or sex, because a lot of people report them not having genitals either. It's like no meat, no sex. Like what do we even have to live for at that point?
Wow. Well, at least you get your taxes done on time,
Yeah, that's true. No procrastination.
Concentrate. Yeah. So Robert Powell wants to know, if this is a future us, why so many different UAP shapes, and why did the dominant shape change from disc to triangle over time? Yeah,
I actually have a theory about that. It's only based on a lot of research I've been doing recently in association with this book I'm writing. And I'm not just trying to plug this or anything. It's coming up a lot because I've learned a lot since writing this last book, and especially about individual case studies and different things people have experienced. But my own thoughts on this, and this is just my opinion. I'm, again, not a ufologist, but from looking at these things and studying patterns, it almost seems like these triangle-shaped craft, and especially the big ones, some of these things are huge. But you look at, for say, Terry Lovelace's encounter. Him and his friend Toby are just laying down in this meadow just outside of Devil's Den, and this massive triangular craft blocks out the night sky, the stars, then hovers over them. They have UFO apathy, and then they're inside of it, and the same characteristics of that craft, inside and out, are described in a couple of other different reports that I highlight in the book as well. Seemingly the same thing, the same craft. There's descriptions of walls of gestating fetuses and very human-looking or humanoid beings walking around, seemingly going about their business working. But what's interesting is that in a couple of these cases, that same triangular craft heads up to a moon base on the dark side of the moon. So I kind of wonder if these triangle-shaped craft are simply kind of the transport, the go-between between a moon base, and it's obviously highly speculative and borders on conspiracy theory to say that it's up there, but I've never seen the backside of the moon. The vast majority of us haven't. I don't even think you're allowed to just go up there and fly around and look at it. Not that we could anyway. But I kind of wonder if it's more of a stationary, stays in our time sort of thing that was built in association with this moon base. And then the other disc-shaped craft remain capable of time travel technology. So it's based on other people's reports and kind of linking together a number of patterns I've seen in these reports, but it remains a highly speculative idea. I will admit that.
All right. The next question. Let's see. Bob Fabian is asking, when do you think they started coming back? If you could, for instance, longer than 150 years ago, he's asking.
Personally, if I was trying to learn about my own evolutionary past, I would go back as far as physically possible. If they are bound by the laws of physics and they can only travel so far into the past because they can only achieve certain speeds, linear speeds in association with that angular momentum, then there may be an upper limit. And obviously, as we get farther into the future, there may be an upper limit for how far back they could come. So I don't know. I mean, the UFO phenomenon certainly isn't recent. There's evidence historically, even prehistorically, that these same crafts and same beings have been visiting periods throughout the distant human past. So if that's the case, it indicates that they at least can visit thousands of years into their past. Jim Peniston, in his account, describes, at least through that binary code, that they're from 8,000 years in the future. So if they can visit tens of thousands of years, if they could go back and study the Neanderthals and sample genes from them, we would have way more information about our exact evolutionary relationships, how much interbreeding was taking place. Me personally, I've always been really interested in Homo habilis, the first ones to really develop a larger brain size relative to body size. We know less about them. They were likely the first to make and use stone tools. So I have my own biases about when I would go to. But no, I think the phenomenon's been with us throughout at least much of our recent and most likely more distant evolutionary past. I think I heard Jacques Vallée say that too. In fact, that sounded almost like a paraphrase of something he said. But yeah, I don't know. I think it's probably been around for a while.
Matthew has this question. Wouldn't our descendants be contaminating the timeline and causing paradoxes? Or do you subscribe to the multiverse solution to that?
Well, in the context of block time, there aren't really paradoxes in the way that we traditionally think of them. And I kind of blame movies and TV shows for that. Like Back to the Future, and I mean, any number of them. There's relatively few that do a good job of really trying to focus on what would happen if you went back in time in the context of both the block universe and the many worlds interpretation. I've mentioned the show Dark on a couple of occasions. The first two seasons, they follow the block universe model and show how there aren't paradoxes, but rather self-consistency, where even if you feel like you're creating a change, it's something that was always going to happen. You're just still doing the same thing that would have always been done as a result of you being there in the past. And then, yeah, again, it comes down to the different timelines thing, the block universe versus the many worlds interpretation. And in that case, it does get around not only the perceived paradoxes, which again, and I talk about this a lot in chapters 6 and 12 in my book, they don't really exist in the context of the Novikov self-consistency principle. But the many worlds interpretation not only helps provide an easy out to that, but also one that I found pisses people off to no end is the issue of free will. Because if everything is already going to happen the way that it did and everything in the future, if you're looking back at it from the future into the past, there's still only one outcome. So people unfortunately take that to mean that we're just these mindless meat bags that are going through the future with no sense of creating that future. And that tends to piss people off. And I get a lot of hate mail about that, even though it's not my idea. So the many worlds interpretation gives you the ability to still have free will. I decide to go to the past. I decide to kill my grandfather for whatever reason. And then there's this new timeline that forms. So it is appealing to people for those reasons. But again, I think it's going to be some time before we know which one is more accurate.
All right. Another question. Are you familiar with the symbols reported in the Zamora and Rendlesham encounters? And they just wonder if you have an opinion or if this relates to your ideas. And I guess I should note that the primary witness in the Rendlesham incident, one of them, believes that what he saw was something from the future, actually.
Yeah, definitely. And I think I bought Jim Peniston's book recently, and I think some of those symbols are on the cover of his book. And there's other case studies as well where they describe almost hieroglyphic looking symbolism in association with likely their language, which I think is funny if that is the case, and if these are future humans, that we go from hieroglyphics to letters and then back to hieroglyphics again. And in a way, we're kind of doing that with emojis. It's sort of a modern form of hieroglyphics, I guess. But yeah, if that is an aspect of their culture, we would not have any clue what they're saying or what it means, because that changes so fast. The only reason we know what those hieroglyphics mean in a relatively recent period in Egypt and elsewhere throughout Samaria during Mesopotamian times, dawn of agriculture, and even before that is, not actually, about 3,000 or 4,000 years ago, I guess, way after agriculture, is because of the Rosetta Stone, where we know one language and then we can decipher these other ones by figuring out what the symbols mean. But if we're talking about 8,000 years in the future, which is what, as you mentioned, the primary witness described these humans as being from, who knows? I mean, there's language changes so fast. You have isolation of any group, and within a short period of time, they're going to have a really strong dialect. And then after a slightly longer period of time, their language is almost unrecognizable. So, yeah, I mean, you can see that with Portuguese and Spanish. They can understand each other. It's not easy to talk. Romansh, German, the 4 languages of Switzerland, all different. Despite being right there in the middle, they still have all of these different linguistic groups. So, yeah, I think the symbols indicate some sort of cultural continuity, and the use of communicative symbolism, but who knows what it means. It's clearly something specific to their culture.
Yeah, I've wondered if we'd be able to understand English even from 200 years ago.
No, it's impossible. In grad school, I had to read, for an evolutionary biology class, Darwin's original book on the origin of species. Mm-hmm. No idea. I gave up. I went and bought the modern English version, and it pissed me off so much. It's all English. I know the words, but I didn't have a damn clue what they meant. It was ridiculous. I needed the class to graduate too, but I was willing to drop it if I had to actually read that damn thing.
Wow, how about that? Another question here. In moments like flow states or meditation, our sense of time becomes somewhat strange. Will we always experience time in the same way, or does our biology affect this?
And I got to tell you, this has been really fun. Like giving a presentation to a scientific group, you get really cool questions. I mean, I've been on a lot of interviews where we get great questions, but I've really enjoyed these, especially. Yeah, time. I just actually, the American Philosophical Association, actually just a few days ago, published an interview I did with a PhD in philosophy, obviously. And the whole series was about time. I think it was called Time Will Tell. And I addressed that specifically in the context of this sort of notion of time in the sense of our consciousness and the physical reality of time, how we perceive things within our environment. And I talk about something that I've described in some other places, other writings, which I refer to as biorelativity, where we seem to have differences in the way specific animals and insects versus birds versus humans versus sloths, where we perceive time differently, but within the context of our own survivability, that we've almost evolved a perception of time that helps us survive and procreate within a specific environment. So as you're swatting a fly, it probably sees this thing coming down. It's like, crap, I got to get out of the way. Or, it would probably smash me. Or, swallows flying through the rafters of a barn. Like if you put a helmet on a kid and a little jetpack and told it to go do that, a kid could probably do it better because they perceive time faster than we do. But an adult, especially an aged adult, would just be smashing into all of those rafters, and simply because of how we've come to perceive time based on our own lives and as a species, how we've evolved to perceive it. So I do kind of create this separation in my mind. And also, you see it throughout life as we age. You see it when you're bored or when you're really excited about something. You see it when you do psychedelic drugs. It completely changes your perception of time, and it can stop entirely for short periods, I've been told. So there's definitely a separation. It's not quantized. Time isn't quantized. You can't break it down into some fundamental unit. And it's I don't know. It's an aspect of the nature of reality that I think we should be studying more. And I commend the American Philosophical Association for really trying to address these things, and in the context of consciousness too. It's one of these taboo things, not as taboo as UFOs, but we should really be having a conversation about consciousness. And I think our perception of time is fundamental to that. Even though it's not a fundamental aspect of nature, I think it is certainly something that shapes who we are. I heard Sean Carroll say recently that time is one of the most used words in the English language. It structures almost everything we do. But I definitely think there is kind of a separation between the physical nature of time and how we perceive it as biological beings.
All right, we'll make this the last question, and that is, how is your work generally received by your colleagues?
Pretty well, actually. They've been super supportive, especially here at Montana Tech, where I teach. Really since the beginning. I remember the chair of my department, I was hiring a couple research assistants off of some grant money that I had, kind of to help with some of the things I was researching for this book. And I was like, oh, hey, I'm writing this book about UFOs, time travel, human evolution, kind of explain the premise very basically. And I was like, I just wanted you to know in case everybody starts headhunting me. And he kind of looked at me like with this disgusted look and was like, that's our job. That's what we're supposed to do. We're supposed to be asking questions like that. And then just like shook his head and walked away like it was the dumbest thing I'd ever asked him, which was great. That's where it started. That was about 5 years ago. And when the book came out, it got some international coverage and some pretty mainstream media outlets. And the chancellor of my university saw something in Fox News and shook my hand when I was getting some sort of end of semester award and said, hey, I saw that story about your UFO research. It's really cool. Congratulations. And so, yeah, institutionally, it's been great, even outside amongst my colleagues. And I think a big part of it is because I don't claim to have all of the answers. I'm just trying to start a conversation and hope that we can work together. I've seen more scientists come out recently. And I think there was a space.com article just last week, again, calling for more scientific explanation or investigation of this phenomenon. So hopefully that continues. It's definitely been good to see, and I've been really happy with the response as an individual. It probably helps that I'm a white male. I'll be the first to admit that. If I was a black woman or Hispanic or something, maybe it'd be different. So I do probably benefit from some white privilege aspects of it. But I have a strong publication record. I've published in some well-respected journals and have worked with some really well-respected colleagues throughout the world at different institutions. So I think those that know me and know my research aren't as easy to dismiss this shift into something a little more taboo.
All right, so we'll wrap it up there. Thank you so much. And we were pretty much able to get to most questions. We might not have gotten to a couple, and they could probably email you
Yeah, sure.
if they do
Absolutely.
have questions. And
Yeah, there's a contact page on my website too where people can send me emails.
okay. And down below, I think we have a link to the website for your book as well.
Cool.
Thank you all for joining us. We'll have another SCU conversation like this live stream. We're shooting for November 9th with Peter Reale. So thank you all so much for being here. Thank you to Podcast UFOs, Martin Willis, for helping us in the background there. And thank you so much. It was an excellent presentation. Gives us all something else to think about.
Yeah, thank you, Alejandro. I appreciate all your hard work on this and sticking through all our technical difficulties last week. we got it done. We did it. It's time for some celebratory beers, I would say.
Exactly. All right. Well, thank you so much. You all have a lovely evening, and we'll see you next time.